It is my privilege, it is my honor, it is my joy to bring all of you my top 10 most favorite movies of all time. I want to differentiate really quickly between most favorite and best. I think that when you have a list of best movies of all time, it more has to do with artistic merit. When you have a list of most favorite movies of all time, it has more so to do with what is personal to you. So I know that within this top 10 list, there are going to be some movies that are not really considered the best or maybe even all that good. However, they are my top 10 most favorite. And all I can hope is that you enjoy hearing my thoughts about my top 10 favorite movies, and maybe some of your favorite movies are on this list. Kicking off list number 10, we have Saving Mr. Banks, the best explanation I can give for when anyone asks me why I love Disney so much. This movie is the heart and soul of Disney. It's the spirit of Disney. It says that Disney and everything that it represents can melt the heart of someone who has been hardened by the grim realities of life and dare them to let their guard down to some hope. It doesn't ask us to not acknowledge the horrors of everyday life, but it asks us to be inspired and focus on the magic of everyday life in spite of the horrors, in spite of what we encounter through everyday life that threatens to bring us down. It's because in spite of the horrors that we believe in a better reality, a reality that might already exist out there, regardless of how hard it is to find. So right off the bat in the opening of this movie, I love the fact that they had this kind of old school 1960s-ish text. It really set the scene for the rest of the movie, and what even set the scene more so was this kind of eerie, but in a beautiful way, piano floating rendition of Chim Chim Cheree. And actually, Thomas Newman, who wrote the music for WALL-E and plenty of other great Pixar films, wrote the music for this. I think it would have been even better / more awesome if the Sherman Brothers had wrote it. It seems appropriate, but at the same time, sometimes you like it when a different artist can come into a beloved work of art and bring their own fresh take on things. We are quickly introduced to Emma Thompson's character, Pamela Travers. I'm always tempted to say Pamela, but I'm pretty sure it's Pamela Travers. And the way that she's introduced is so funny because within just a few seconds you get sort of the both sides of her character. On one hand, she is sitting there all meditatively thinking about her past and all the wonderful things that she might have suppressed, and then she opens her eyes and stares directly into the camera with a glare that could kill you. And as always, Emma Thompson killed it. I mean, she's a genius. What else do I have to say? She wasn't nominated for the Best Actress in a Leading Role for this movie, which outraged everybody, myself included. One might even say she's practically perfect in every way. A theme that this movie explores is the fact that Mrs. Travers and Disney actually have very similar characteristics despite the fact that they butt heads so much. One of them being that they both really had no regard at all for money, which is most evident at the beginning when Travers says to one of her friends or assistants or whatever, "Stop saying money. It's a filthy, disgusting word." We flash back to Pamela, Mrs. Travers' childhood, and we're introduced to her father, which, might I say, is the exact kind of father, nay, the kind of man that I someday hope to be, minus the raging and life-shattering alcoholism. His love of life and his ability to incorporate magic into his everyday life and his just pure willingness and his love for creating fun and fantasy for his daughters is pure inspiration. His wife definitely doesn't share the same sentiments. When they're moving from one house to the other and he decides to take a walk because a leisurely stroll is a gift, my dear, she's very embarrassed by the fact that he calls them all his row of ducklings. But I suppose that's the point, she represents balance because you can't be caught up in that fantasy all the time. I do think it's healthy, no matter what age you are, to use your imagination and to have some fun with life no matter what's happening. It could be something as mundane as going from one house to the next. But at the same time, you do need that balance in life. You need to be able to work and support a family and be serious every now and then, which is properly manifested in his wife. Maybe a little too much so, but more on that later. Mrs. Travers arrives to Los Angeles, and then we're introduced to yet another character that I hope to someday become, even more so than her father. This is why I love this movie so much. It's just full of these characters that I aspire to be. Yes, they're fictitious, and yes, they may not necessarily have much grounding in reality, but that's one of the points of the movie. That's one of the things that Disney himself points out. Yeah, maybe they're not real in the sense that they're not a living, breathing organism in objective reality, but they exist up here in your mind. And if they exist up here in your mind, then you can make it as legitimate as you want it to be. Ralph, played by the wonderful Paul Giamatti, is immune to criticism, finds the wonderful joy in the everyday aspects of life, and is an eternal optimist. The top 3 characteristics that I hope to someday possess to the same level that he does. She arrives at the Disney studio where we meet the legendary Don DeGrady, writer of Mary Poppins as well as other classic animated films, and the Sherman brothers, who, might I say, I would have given my left arm to have their kind of life. To be able to create and produce music, part of films that define generations, and to work with the great Walt Disney himself at such a close relationship that he calls them his boys. Oh man, one can only dream. A short while later, she meets the man, the myth, the absolute legend, Tom Hanks. And Walt Disney. So let's talk a minute about what the movie got right about Walt Disney and what it got a little bit inaccurate. First of all, the things that it got right. Yes, Walt Disney was a pretty bad chain smoker. He smoked about 2 packs a day. He was often introduced into a room or an area by his cough. You could hear him coughing down the hallway. And the Sherman brothers and any kind of employee working for Disney would often announce his presence by saying, "Man is in the forest," which is a line used in Bambi, fun fact, because you could just hear him coughing down the hallway. So that was kind of a fun bit of trivia. It's also true that he went on a first-name basis with everybody in his studio. He didn't like to be called Mr. Disney because one of his fantasies that he tried to bring to life as much as possible was creating collaboration and a community within his studio. And of course, one of the best ways, probably the foundational way to do that, is by going on a first-name basis. His Western twang is perfectly emulated by the great Tom Hanks. And most importantly, his absolute assurance of his own opinion and vision is depicted in the movie. Best described by that wonderful scene where the secretary is telling him the ideas that Mrs. Travers has for the movie, and she talks about Mr. Banks' mustache, and she says, Mrs. Travers is wondering why he is supposed to have a mustache. And Disney goes, "Oh, I asked for that." Well, yes, she's just wanting to know why, because I asked for it. It just perfectly emulates his unwillingness to swerve from whatever it was that he wanted to get done. Now for a few inaccuracies. He's depicted as being very jovial and lighthearted and very loving at this particular point in his career, which unfortunately was starting to become the tail end. And it is true that in his early years, he was very jovial. He was always pulling pranks. He was always in a good mood. He was always finding the fun in things, despite the fact that his father was a militant, pedantic man. But towards the end of his career, you honestly didn't know what kind of Walt you were going to get day to day. He might be in a good mood. He might be in a bad mood. It honestly changed depending on a variety of things. He was also very minimal in his compliments. That's one of the things that he's most known for, I would say. And there's no way that the real Walt Disney would have said something like, "Oh, that's iconic. I won't be able to stop singing that for weeks." He would never have said that. High praise in the Disney studio was considered, "That'll work," which kudos to the movie for including that line. The scene where childhood Pamela, yeah, I did it again. The scene where Pamela sits down with her father and then he explains to her that the world is an illusion is key, because it strikes the ideal, but ultimately the failure of living that kind of life. Yes, you want to have fun, and yes, you do want to engage your own imagination into your day-to-day life and keep the realities at bay, but you can't do it all the time. You can't live and die by that, and you certainly can't escape into vices like alcoholism or, pick your poison. There are all kinds of things out there. You do have to face life. There's no doubt about it. You have to face it with courage and all those good qualities. But at the same time, you can't live and die by it. And you don't want to lose that inner child that's within you. A quote that is attributed to Disney, and I believe he said it, and it perfectly sums up everything that he represented, in my opinion, is that his content is not made for children. It's made for the child in all of us. That inner child lives in Mrs. Travers, maybe even more so than Walt himself. And that's another thing that's explored throughout this entire movie. One of the main reasons why this is one of my most favorite movies of all time is that it contains one of the greatest scenes of all time. It's not too impressive from a screenplay standpoint. You can probably analyze the technical aspects behind it. The cinematography is nice, the lighting is nice, the acting is pretty good, of course. Tom Hanks is in the scene. But the reason why I love it so much is because it is so personal to me. It Well, first of all, as I've said in past reviews, I love these unexpected jam sessions. Now, the scene that I'm talking about is when Disney walks in to the Sherman Brothers playing Feed the Birds. Feed the Birds is possibly my most favorite Disney song. I guess there is some competition with Hakuna Matata, but that one might actually lose out to Feed the Birds because it is the perfect embodiment of what Disney is all about. Walt himself has said that this was his most favorite song, and he would actually ask the Sherman Brothers to play it whenever he felt depressed, because despite the fact that it's not the most jovial song of all time, it really just lifts your spirits by its message. And I think that its message is feed the birds tuppence a bag, as in, it's very easy to do these small little acts of kindness every day to things that go unnoticed. I mean, most people, at least where I live, I don't know if it's different in other parts of the globe, but most people don't really pay much mind to birds. They don't think that it's that important to take care of birds. And in the same way, some people might think it's not important to take care of the lesser known people of the world, the sick or the homeless or whatever. But it doesn't take much. It just takes a tuppence a bag to make a little bit of difference in their life, to spread just a little bit of love. And that is the message of Disney. And this is actually the song that won Mrs. Travers over, not Let's Go Fly a Kite as depicted in the movie, which just gives the song even more credence and even more power than it already has. Let's fast forward a bit to the scene with Pam and her dad on his deathbed. This scene is debilitatingly sad, mostly thanks to Colin Farrell's masterful acting. My personal interpretation of this scene, which could be wrong even as I was thinking about it, is that he doesn't want his daughter to see him this way. He doesn't want her to see him as this dying alcoholic, so he tries to push her away by coldly and callously disregarding her poem. He says, well, it's not Yeats, is it? He just takes it, grabs it out of her hand, but when he reads it, you can see all these emotions just literally trembling in his face. He doesn't know whether to cry about the beauty that his daughter wrote a poem for him, or cry because he knows his life is over, or cry because he's still caught up in alcoholism and he can't be the best dad that he can be. So he just tries to shove her away, metaphorically speaking. Of course, another interpretation, and perhaps one that might be a bit more accurate, is that he's let the alcohol take over him so thoroughly that he can't even be happy with his children anymore. What do you guys think? I'd like to hear your thoughts about that particular scene. When I was watching this movie, I thought that it was rated PG, just because it's very Disney. But the scene where Pam's mother tries to drown herself, I was just like, dang, this is a pretty hardcore scene for a PG movie. But then I looked up and it is in fact PG-13. So, yeah. I think the creepiest part of this scene is not when Pam's mother tries to drown herself, but it's right before, when she's standing over her bed and there's this like orange light glow, and she's just like, she has her head cocked to one side and her eyebrows are up, and there's a moment of sheer horror movie quality when she's staring at her bed, a single tear comes down her cheek, she grins a little, cocks her head, and the music does that horror movie thing where the strings bend down. I almost recoiled when I first saw it. I was like, oh. Question, was she having a nightmare or a night terror, or was she sleep paralysis or something? I'm not entirely sure, because she seems totally lucid. But then when she goes into the river and Pam yanks at her dress, she snaps out of it. So, yeah, that's another question that I have for you guys. What exactly was she experiencing? Another reason why I love this movie is because it explains the power that storytellers have, and thereby explains the power of movies. When Walt Disney comes to visit Mrs. Travers to try and connect with her as to why she still won't sign over the rights to him, he says that we are storytellers. And storytellers instill hope again and again and again. Now, the great thing about stories is that you don't necessarily have to go down that route. You can do whatever you want with a story. But classically, and specifically in the American consciousness, stories instill hope again and again and again. And I think it was Jim Carrey who said something equally poignant. We give relief to people for just a little bit of time. We give them relief of their day-to-day walk. And that's why I think the movie business survived during the Great Depression, because people went to movies to escape. They went to movies to forget about their reality just for a little bit. You could say that forgetting about your reality is against the message of this movie, because Mrs. Travers tries to suppress her reality, which in turn turns her into a bit of a monster. But sometimes there are those pieces of art, there are those movies that are so inspiring, that are so powerful, they actually cause you to change certain aspects of your life, and that's where their true power comes in. There's a small detail when Mrs. Travers gets to the premiere that I found kind of funny. She walks up and the penguins are right there. It was almost like Disney like giving her the middle finger, like, haha, see, I still get what I want. Just because this is your premiere doesn't mean that I can't put penguins right here and shove it in your face. The only minor criticism I have of this movie is that it ends kind of abruptly. The only thing I would have liked to see would have been some kind of resolution between Travers and Disney. Kind of like Whiplash. I didn't really much care for the ending, even though it got better the more and more I thought about it. I wish there would have been some kind of sit-down resolution conversation between the protagonist, being Disney, and the quote-unquote antagonist, being Mrs. Travers. But at the end of the day, that's not really what it's about. It's about the relationship between the two and what came out of that. So just because there wasn't any kind of resolution sit-down conversation between the two doesn't make the ending bad. Just from a screenwriting standpoint, it's a little abrupt. Disney and Travers represent two similar people who just had very different reactions to similar experiences. Specifically, both experienced trauma at the hand of their fathers. Disney's father was extremely strict and demanded every last bit of Disney, including when he was a very young boy and incapable of doing much of what his father demanded. And Mrs. Travers had what she perceived to be a wonderful father, but one who was not willing to live up to his daily responsibilities. Both experienced the wonder and the magic of life, yet one tried to suppress it through absolute formalism, and the other transformed it into magic. That's why I love the dynamic of these two characters, and that's especially why I'm so thankful that these two masterful actors, Tom Hanks and Emma Thompson, were cast into this movie. And that's one of the many, many reasons why I'm giving this movie a 9.7 out of 10. So, have you seen Saving Mr. Banks? If so, let me know your thoughts about them. I would love to hear them. Let me know down in the comments below. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. I truly appreciate it, and I'll see you on the next cinematic adventure.